In the late 80s, a young Seth Kearsley was growing up in Ventura, California. He had an older friend who was going to the animation school CalArts in Valencia. He often visited the campus on weekends, mostly for their parties, and befriended many of the students there. One time he was on the campus for a party, and in the background he heard a strange beeping noise. He thought it was a smoke detector with a low battery and started looking around trying to find it. He wandered through the animation department until he found a room with a door being propped open by a chair. He looked in and saw a guy working on his student film. He was taking snapshots of his art frame by frame, which explained the beeping sound. Fascinated, Kearsley sat on the chair and watched the guy work. This startled the guy, who initially didn't notice he was there. He had the chair propping the door open because it was very hot in the room and there was no air conditioning. The two chatted for a while. The guy introduced himself and explained what he was doing. His student film was about an old man with a square head and a little kid with a round head who gets a balloon stuck in a tree. Seth left, but always remembered the guy's name because it was a very odd one. That guy was Pete Docter, and years later he would become the chief creative officer at Pixar. Amongst other things, he wrote WALL-E, and that student film he was working on evolved into the movie Up. Over time, Kearsley became enamored with CalArts. He was going there more frequently and soaking in all the amazing art that was on display everywhere. His high school days were coming to an end, and he was thinking about his future. His father was an architect, and the plan was for him to follow in his footsteps. After graduating high school, his parents asked what his plans were for the future, and he surprised them by saying he was thinking of going into animation school. His family said, "We'll support you 100%, just not financially." Tuition for CalArts was very expensive, and while his family wanted to support whatever he did, they just didn't have the money for the school. He decided he was still going to go, and they gave him their blessings. The first year he applied but wasn't accepted, so he went and did a year at a local community college. His family moved to Ohio, and he stayed behind to follow his dream. Although that came at a price. He had very little money, so he was only able to rent a small apartment. Well, not even an apartment. A one-car garage that was turned into an apartment and didn't have a bathroom. So if he needed to use the bathroom, he took a walk to the local Burger King. He got a membership to the local YMCA so he could take showers. Over that year, he worked on building his portfolio. He drew as much as he could and compiled all of his best works together. The next year, thanks to his friends at the school, he was able to set up a meeting with the dean of the animation department. He went in and motor-mouthed his way through his work, telling the dean all the things he had been going through the past year just to get into the school, how he was basically broke and homeless. The dean was quietly flipping through his portfolio, and Kearsley thought his silence meant that he hated it. At the end, he put the book down, reached into a drawer, and pulled out a piece of paper. Kearsley thought he blew it and got up to leave. The dean then handed him the paper and said, "Take this to the admissions office, and I'll see you in the fall." He was stunned. Even after taking the form to the admissions office, he still didn't believe it. It wasn't until a few weeks later when he received his acceptance packet in the mail when he truly believed it. For him, going to CalArts was a dream come true. This was the early 90s, and many of the students there at the time would go on to make massive changes in the animation industry. People like Craig McCracken, who later created the Powerpuff Girls. He knew there were people there that were more talented than he was, but many of them were also kind of lazy. So what he used to his advantage was his work ethic. He knew he couldn't outdraw them, so he decided to outwork them. He spent the next few years putting his nose to the grindstone and grinding. One day close to graduation, he saw a flyer looking for artists for a new animation series for MTV. After the success of MTV's Liquid Television, they were looking to expand their in-house animation. The ad was looking for artists to work on a new series called The Max. The Max was an adaptation of Sam Keith's series of the same name from Image Comics. This would be part of a new animation block MTV would later call MTV's Oddities. Kearsley and two other artists from the school went to apply. They all went in together and showed their portfolios. The interviewer looked at their work and said, "All right, it's going to be $800 a week. You guys in?" The trio played it cool, saying, "Well, that is an interesting offer. We'll get back to you." As they walked out, they struggled to contain their joy. After years of scrounging by on whatever they could, they would be walking out of college and directly into a steady paycheck. They took the job and worked on the first season of the show. The other show in the Oddities block was The Head. which was based on a short from Liquid Television. The Max was the coolest gig, which the three of them didn't realize at the time. They were fresh out of school, and this was their first job. They wrongfully assumed all jobs would be this creatively rewarding. With the Max getting positive attention, MTV was working on a deal with Image to adapt some of their other comics. Next up was Todd McFarlane's Spawn. Kearsley was loving this. With MTV doing animation and companies like Image popping up, it was changing the face of American animation. In the US, animation was still largely seen as kid stuff. He thought, that's what animation was, this is what animation is now. Cool, dark stuff. Sadly, audiences and some of the executives at MTV didn't agree. While critics and fans liked the Max, MTV was having some internal issues and canceled the series. The Max ended its run with 13 11-minute episodes, and The Head went on for 2 seasons with 14 episodes. MTV lost the Spawn rights to HBO and killed the Oddities block. Eric Fogel, the creator of The Head, stayed with MTV and created the wildly successful claymation show Celebrity Deathmatch, which ran for 100 episodes over 9 years. As the job was coming to an end, Kearsley started to panic. He had nothing lined up, and once this job was over, he was back to being broke. He thought, oh no, I'm done. I have nothing to do, and I'm going to have to go back to construction. I'm never going to get out of all this student debt. His panic was short-lived, and he landed jobs working on Timon and Pumbaa, The Simpsons, and Nightmare Ned. With this experience under his belt, he went to work for Deke, with his first job as an animation director and producer on the show Mummies Alive. The team worked incredibly hard on the project, but were hamstrung by the time slot, Mondays through Thursdays at 7 a.m. He worked through a full 42 episodes for syndication, and the series was canceled. The associate producer could see the show was going to be canceled, so he left for a job with Sony Animation. Sony Animation was blowing up at the time. In a very short period, they went from 2 shows to 8. The executive producer at Sony Animation also used to work for Deke. He saw Mummies Alive and said, "Whoa, this show is good." The animation and storytelling was on another level beyond the usual output from the company. Kearsley then got a job working for Sony as the supervising director for the UPN show Dilbert. Meanwhile, in the late 90s, Adam Sandler was box office gold. His last few movies were massively successful, including Big Daddy, which made $235 million on a $34 million budget, and The Waterboy, which was the 5th highest domestic grossing film of 1998. Around that time, Sandler was working on his 4th comedy album, Stan and Judy's Kid. He was in the studio mixing the album when he got a visit from producer Amy Pascal. She asked to hear one of the tracks, and he played Whitey. Whitey was one of his characters, and she couldn't stop laughing at the 16-minute track. She loved the bit and asked what he was going to do with it. He responded that he was thinking of making it into something animated. She then bought it on the spot and agreed to help him turn the idea into an animated feature. Kearsley heard about this animated feature from Happy Madison starring Adam Sandler, and he wanted in. For him, this would be a dream job to work with Sandler. He'd seen all of his movies repeatedly and admitted he was the annoying guy who was always quoting his films.
Why didn't you just go home? That's your home! Are you too good for your home?
Kearsley tried to get on as the director, but they already had another guy lined up. However, they liked his work and offered him the job to be the sequence director. Kearsley was torn. After Mummies Alive, he had way more experience at directing than the guy who they already hired. He saw taking the sequence director job as a step down. His friends convinced him to take the job. Going from TV to film was too huge a deal to pass up. He called the producer and said he'd take it. This was on a Friday. The following Monday, Kearsley was getting ready to go to work on Dilbert. The supervising producer called and said, "Don't go into work today. I need you to go to Sandler's house." What? He told him the director they hired was just fired. What happened was Sony was really excited about the movie and asked the director on Friday if he could put together some thumbnails for part of the script. Monday morning, he arrived for a meeting and had nothing. Not only that, they started to discuss the film's timeline, and he stopped them saying, that's not going to work for me. See, I'm getting married around the time we'd be filming, and I was planning on taking a month off. So they essentially said,
You're fired!
"You should have told us this from the beginning. We would have never hired you to begin with." The fired guy left the room, and now all eyes were on the producer. It looked bad for him because this was the guy he suggested. He should have been vetted better. He told them not to worry because he had a backup. He called Kearsley, and the next thing he knew, he was calling out of work on Dilbert to head over to Adam Sandler's house in Bel Air. Kearsley thought about what he could do to impress Sandler that wouldn't be too obvious. Since he was a huge fan, he knew Sandler's father was an electrical engineer. He thought they could bond over something small: shoes. Seth grew up working in construction, helping his father, and as such, he owned a pair of Timberland boots. Sandler was often seen wearing Timberlands, so he purposely wore them to see Sandler, hoping it would turn into something to talk about and possibly bond over. He went to the house, rang the doorbell, and waited. Off to his left, he hears, "Hello!" Sandler came out the side door and invited him into the house. They went inside and engaged in some small talk. They had similar small-town roots. Sandler noticed the shoes, and they talked about their fathers. Kearsley was overjoyed that Sandler was exactly the guy he hoped he was. Down to earth, the most normal dude you could ask for. This was now early 2000. Kearsley was 29 at the time, and Sandler joked that he was already at a point in his career where the directors were younger than him. Sandler then gave him a copy of the script and asked him to give it a quick read while he did some other things around the house. Kearsley was nervous. He knew this job could come or go quickly. The script was called 8 Crazy Nights, which was a line from Sandler's Hanukkah song. It was a first draft and it needed a lot of work. He wasn't going to say that, however, because he wanted the job. So when asked what he thought, he just said it was great. The script was about the town drunk and the town joke, coming together and learning something from each other, both of which would be voiced by Sandler. Kearsley thought this kind of storyline never happens. The tale of two small-town losers told through an animated Hanukkah musical with fart jokes. Kearsley knew he didn't have the job yet. This was just the interview, but he felt they hit it off well. A few days later, he was called back to Sandler's house. When he arrived, he met Adam's parents. Adam had to take care of a few things, so he told Kearsley to talk to his folks. Sandler joked, "Now this is the real interview." Kearsley talked to his folks, and really, he said it was easier than talking to Adam simply because he's always been more comfortable talking to older people. He also doesn't think he was joking. He felt this was the real interview. About 2 days later, he got the call that he got the job. He did still have to meet with Happy Madison before it was finalized, though. They gave him more of a traditional job interview. They asked questions like, what can you bring to the production? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? That kind of thing. The studio was in a rush. They figured they could get this project completed within a year from start to finish. The production was going through Sony, but since they didn't have an animated film division yet, the foundation was essentially independent. This was a few years before Sony Pictures Animation. There wasn't studio space or anything, so Sony put them into a couple of rooms above a soundstage on the Sony lot. It unfortunately was miserable. The building was just storage, so there was no heating or cooling. Also, no bathrooms. They'd crank open the windows to get some air, but right below them was where the diesel trucks parked to drop off props to the storage buildings. So they had to decide, do we sweat or breathe in exhaust fumes? After a short time with this, they were able to move out. The budget was $25 million. Gradually, the production team grew. The Dilbert series had come to an end, so Kearsley brought in many of the people he worked with. Kearsley was working on the foundation for the film, but was dealing with an executive producer who had a completely different idea of how it should be made. The producer's plan was essentially based on a made-for-TV model, which is drastically different from a theatrical movie. For TV, you do the character layout here, and then ship the whole thing over to Korea to do the animation. What Kearsley wanted to do was the design and half the animation in LA, and then have the remainder outsourced to other studios around the world. This way they'd have better control over the quality of the production. Unfortunately, they were at the mercy of the producer, and had to do as he instructed. The producer was looking at this like it was a direct-to-video project instead of a theatrical film. They cobbled a crew together, animators and artists from other studios. Their line producer was the associate producer from Dilbert. The associate producer had meeting after meeting with the executive producer and tried to put together a production schedule that matched the budget. Finally, the line producer said, This isn't possible the way he's describing it. There's no way to make the current budget work. The numbers just don't add up. The executive producer then told the team he wanted them to thumbnail out the entire movie in a week. This was a monumental waste of time because what was the point? They'd rush through this and the quality wouldn't be that great since they only had a week. After a week, they delivered the thumbnails, to which the producer said, "I think we're pretty close." Pretty close to what? Kearsley knew they just spent a week doing a bunch of work that was going to be thrown out, which is exactly what happened. 1 week on a film that's supposed to be finished in a year is a lot of time wasted. They could have spent that time working on storyboards. The line producer quit, saying that the executive producer obviously had no idea what he was doing. After seeing things were getting messy and people were leaving, Happy Madison called in the big guns. They brought in Bonnie Arnold, the producer of Toy Story, to audit the production. She spent some time there, sat in on meetings, and talked to the producer. At the end, she went to Happy Madison and said, "This guy has no idea the state of his production. He had no clue what he was doing, or any idea how to deliver a completed film." She said his production meetings were the least productive and most confusing meetings she had ever sat in on. Everyone who worked with him in the past was like, "Yep, that's how it was when we worked with him." Needless to say, he was also fired. The studio was looking at their options and just considered canceling the whole thing. They were thinking it might have been cheaper to just cut their losses and drop it. However, they were convinced to keep going. A new executive producer was brought in who actually knew what he was doing. His name was Ken Samura. Ken had previously worked on Tailspin, The Simpsons, and just finished Joseph King of Dreams for DreamWorks Animation. Ken completely turned the production around. The people working on the film said it had 2 phases, pre-Ken and post-Ken. Pre-Ken, the film was a disaster that was never going to get made, but post-Ken, they now had someone who would work with the team and set a clear path for the film. Ken brought in a new plan. They were going to animate half the movie here in town, and the other half would be animated in other countries. There was a catch, though. The other studios that were doing the animation all around the world had to speak English, so there'd be no confusion like in TV animation. In TV animation, they'd often recycle shots or misinterpret what the theme was because the people doing the animation had no grasp of the language. Many times, the animation didn't line up with what the characters were saying because the animators didn't understand it. Around this time, the animation industry was going through some major changes. Disney's Pixar Studios had 3 massive hits in a row: Toy Story, A Bug's Life, and Toy Story 2. Hollywood, as what often happens, took the wrong message from this. They looked at the films and said, "Oh, this is why our animated movies aren't doing well. It's not the bad stories, lame characters, or dumb plots. It's the style of animation that's the problem. Audiences don't want 2D animation anymore. They want 3D animation." They insisted this was the future. So numerous major 2D animation studios were closing to make way for this new, better animation. I was also told a rumor that I couldn't confirm. Allegedly, it seemed another reason the studios were being closed was money. The old 2D studios were already unionized, but if they shut them down and started new 3D studios, they could pay hungry young animators peanuts compared to what they were paying the experienced 2D workers. Anyway, 2D animation studios at Fox, Warner Brothers, and even Disney were all closing. As terrible as this was, the 8 Crazy Nights production benefited from the collapse. Months ago, when they started working on the movie, none of these studios were available. Now they were finishing out their contracts, and the shops were closing. So not only were they available, but they needed the work. The production was now able to set up shops all around the world with some of the best in the business to work on the animation. In Phoenix, Arizona, they had what was left of Fox Animation, the team that did Anastasia. They were shut down 10 days after the release of what would be their final film, Titan A.E. In Florida, they had what was left of Disney Florida, the team that did Mulan. Yowza in Ontario, who helped Fox with Titan A.E. They had other studios in Denmark, London, and Greece. All of these would be working in conjunction with the main team in California. They did plan to ship some work to Korea and Japan, but it was mostly background characters. Japan would do the effects stuff, and Korea handled the crowds. Overseas would deliver just the animation, and then it was inked and painted at Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers was just finishing up Osmosis Jones. This was the same team that did the Iron Giant. All the digital animation, backgrounds, compositing, scene planning, and paints was done using the tech developed for the Iron Giant. The director flew around the world to meet with each of the animation teams to discuss how the characters moved and specifically what sequences they'd be in charge of. This was the early 2000s, so this was pre-video chat. The look of 8 Crazy Nights was heavily influenced by the 1961 film 101 Dalmatians. They wanted to animate 8 Crazy Nights to have that classic holiday look. With all the talent they had, they insisted on making this look great. With the new executive producer on board, he was able to get an additional year for the film. He was also able to increase the budget from $25 to $35 million. Things finally got underway in late 2000. Adam's vision for the movie was for this to feel like the old classic animated films. There were so many Christmas classics, and he wanted to make a Hanukkah classic, something that would be just as beloved and watched every year. The problem was, in the script, the lead character Davy was downright nasty, and they couldn't seem to redeem him. He was too evil, so they rewrote him to soften him up a bit. Adam Sandler, Brooks Arthur, Brad Isaacs, and Alan Covert all contributed to the writing and rewriting of the script, which continued throughout the production. Davy's character was softened, but it still had that obnoxious charm that was more in line with something like Happy Gilmore than Charlie Brown. The town of Dewsbury was based off Sandler's hometown, Manchester, New Hampshire. The production designer took pictures, and they copied them almost exactly. Happy Madison had a lot of influence over the look of the characters. Adam Sandler was heavily involved in many aspects of the production. He had specific ideas for not only the looks of the characters, but how they moved. Whitey was a combination of multiple people from Sandler's hometown, largely the coach who dedicated his life to church league basketball. To show how Whitey moved, Sandler acted him out. Sandler was in the studio nearly every day. There were a few gaps, like when he left to shoot Punch Drunk Love and Anger Management, but when he wasn't doing another film, he was there. Since this was being made with Happy Madison, they just hired many of the regulars to do the voice work. Rob Schneider, John Lovitz, Kevin Nealon, and others. Many of them did multiple voices. Adam voiced at least 4 different characters. It made the whole process much smoother, since they didn't have to do rounds of interviews and deal with agents. They hired one relatively new actress, Jackie Titone. Jackie had a small part in 1999's Deuce Bigalow, which led to Rob Schneider introducing her to Adam Sandler, who then cast her in Big Daddy. Jackie had small parts in a few Happy Madison productions, but was then offered the role of Jennifer in 8 Crazy Nights, which would be her first leading role. They designed the characters to look like their actors. The look of Benjamin, Jennifer's son, was based on a picture of Alan Covert from when he was 12. Davy's look was based off of a picture of Adam Sandler when he was 19. Davy's parents were voiced by Sandler's real parents, Stan and Judy. The animation was done the old-fashioned way. It was all hand-drawn on paper. They scanned it into the computer for coloring and compositing. If a vehicle was stationary, it was hand-drawn, but if it was moving, it was animated in CG. So the cars, buses, and snowmobile were all CG. The director recognizes the need to use computers for some things in animation, but feels the magic is lost when you go all computer. For the serious moments, they animated them in-house to make sure they got the look right. The director went from being nervous around Adam Sandler to being comfortable and thinking of him as a coworker and friend. One day early in the production, Sandler was in Kearsley's office. Kearsley asked him if he could do a lap around the artist area and just say hi to everyone. It would do wonders for morale. He said, "Oh yeah, I didn't want to bother them. They're all so busy." And the director was like, "No, they're here for you. It would mean the world to them." So he did this every so often, and they loved it. He got to know the people who worked on the movie. Kearsley said over time Sandler knew some of them better than he did, because that's the kind of guy he is. Whitey's favorite place, the mall, was its own character. They wanted the mall to be authentic and not filled with fake stores, so they asked a bunch of companies to let them use their logos, but got no money for product placements. Months went by and they kept writing and rewriting some of the jokes. The problem with animation and comedy is you have to live with the jokes for so long that they aren't funny anymore, so they weren't sure if the stuff that they had was funny or not. It was funny when they first heard it, but after the 100th time, not so much. They started second-guessing themselves because they weren't sure which version of the various jokes was funny. They were getting closer to being finished, so the studio held some test screenings. The audiences were mostly offended. They hated the voice of Whitey, but Sandler loved it. That was the exact voice he used in his comedy album and didn't want to change it. That would change the entire character. The movie originally opened with Whitey going to the mall, which led into the first musical number. They cut that completely to reduce his screen time. Now the movie opens with Davy in the Chinese restaurant. Many of the songs originally were longer, but they were shortened to please the test audiences. Although the scene with Whitey in the overturned porta potty got the biggest reaction, both good and bad. There were some scenes Kearsley wanted taken out, but they tested so well the studio left them in. Animation is usually aimed at kids 6 through 12, but the humor in this was more for teens 15 and up. Although they pushed it a little too far, and when they sent it out for a rating, it came back with an R. They had to pull some things out to get a PG-13. Sony delayed the release of the film to give them more time to fine-tune it. This gave them a chance to clean up some of the animation, as well as work to get it down to a PG-13. After some major hurdles, insane hours, and numerous studio hiccups, the film was done. Early. In 8 crazy months, they were able to get all the principal animation, all layouts, all backgrounds, all the stuff they needed to get done. They made the film in half the time and for 1/3 of the price of traditional studio animation. They submitted the final mix almost 2 years from the start date. Now they had 9 months to wait before they could release it. It wouldn't make sense to release a Hanukkah film in the middle of spring. So now they had months to wait for the release. During that time, Kearsley did what many would do. Smoked weed and played video games. Grand Theft Auto 3 was relatively new, and he played that non-stop. When not doing that, he had meetings for future jobs. Although, since he just did animation, he wanted to try to direct a live-action film next. Unfortunately, the scripts he was getting weren't the best. He was offered Dumb and Dumberer, the one without Jim Carrey. He read the script and it was terrible. He asked if he could do a rewrite, and they said, "No, this is the shooting script. Do you want the gig or not?" He passed. He also passed on the Garfield movie. He kept holding out for that perfect movie, but never got it. His agent kept telling him to take one of these jobs. When 8 Crazy Nights opens, you don't know what's going to happen. If it's a big hit, that's great, but what if it isn't? You need to have something lined up before, just in case. He wasn't thinking clearly. He directed Mummies when he was 23. He started 8 Crazy Nights when he was 29 and turned 30 while filming. He was young, thinking he still had plenty of opportunities. There were 2 jobs he really fought for but didn't get. He was repeatedly interviewed for Mr. Megorium's Wonder Emporium, but that ended up going to the writer Zach Helm and didn't come together until years later. The other was a Happy Madison film that would have been amazing. It was Rob Schneider as essentially a Conan-like character in a movie that was heavily influenced by Monty Python. That one just simply never happened. When not on interviews or playing video games, he was watching anime. He thought about how American TV animation doesn't go hard like stuff in Japan. He thought back to how in Mummies Alive they had all these rules, like how you can't punch anyone in the head or do anything that a kid could imitate. Meanwhile, in something like Digimon, kids in the show were dying. He had an idea for something he thought of as American anime. He knew the demographic would be smaller, but it would be more hardcore and dedicated. He thought back and felt the Max was probably the closest thing to an American anime, at least at the time. He spoke to his agent, who told him about a project at Disney where they were mixing American characters with Japanese characters. This was Kingdom Hearts. He never heard of the game, but since he had the time, he bought it and played through the whole thing. Square and Disney were planning an animated series based on the game. Kearsley had a meeting with some of the bosses about directing the show. They gave him a copy of the current script, and it wasn't the game. He said the script they had was like a show about Aladdin that was guest starring the characters from Kingdom Hearts instead of the other way around. He had another meeting with the executives and told them this wasn't right. The fans weren't going to like it. He asked if he could rewrite the script. They said no, and he lost the job. He talked to the head of the project and said, "Look, I played the games, and anyone watching the show is going to be doing it because of the game. You gotta stay true to the source. The current script is just a generic American TV show. It's losing all that's cool and different about Kingdom Hearts. So they decided to let him do a rewrite, which they liked so much they requested an animatic pilot. An animatic is a string of storyboard images edited together with sound to illustrate how a sequence will flow in motion. It's a way of presenting what the product will look like before investing in full-blown animation. He put together a small team and did an 11-minute pilot. For the voices, they had Hayden Panettiere, Bobby Edner, David Gallagher, and many of the actors from the games to reprise their voice roles. They tested it with the target audience, kids, and it tested better than anything else the studio had. Even though it did well, Square Enix decided to scrap the project in favor of doing an animated series for one of their other IPs. In the end, they didn't do that either, so the whole project was more or less forgotten. In 2022, Kearsley released the 11-minute animatic on his YouTube channel. He said it had been 20 years, and he just wanted to show his work. He knew fans of the series would love to see it, as they had been asking for it for years. Unfortunately, Disney caught wind of this and asked him to take it down, which he did. Back to 2002, after months of waiting, 8 Crazy Nights hit theaters. The movie was released on November 27, 2002. It was released on quite possibly one of the most stacked opening weekends in history. 8 Crazy Nights was up against a new Bond, a new Harry Potter, a new Santa Claus, and a new 2D animated Disney film. They came in 5th behind Bond and Potter, both of which set new box office records. It also came out at a time when the pendulum had swung back against Sandler. There was a time with his films where he was a hit factory, but somewhere it became cool to hate him. It also pissed people off. Mothers took their young children thinking this was a cute holiday movie. Some people still by default assume animation means kid-friendly, although their audience was largely teenage boys who was their target demo. They traditionally wouldn't see an animated film, but they loved Sandler and loved fart jokes. 8 Crazy Nights was talked about like it bombed when really it was profitable within the first year. It was a $35 million movie that was made in 2 years, as opposed to Disney's Treasure Planet, which was a $140 million movie that took 5 years. It also beat Disney on a per-screen basis, which is kind of a big deal, especially when you consider the marketing they had behind Treasure Planet. Now that 8 Crazy Nights was out, Kearsley was looking back on all the jobs he turned down.
The 8 Crazy Nights opened a whole hallway full of doors. All of the doors were open. And I ran down that hallway slamming doors as I went because I'm gonna do live action next. Assuming that the door at the end of the hall was that live action feature that I was going to do. And then I went through that door and I was in the parking lot. And I was like, I should have taken one of those jobs back there.
Although most of the jobs he passed on never got produced anyway. Some of them did get made, and they were horrible pieces of garbage. Without anything lined up, he took a job working on Family Guy. Kearsley stayed in contact with Sandler. He sent him a pitch for 8 Crazy Nights too. He said it was a year later, and there were complications between Davey and Jennifer, which landed him back on Whitey's couch. Although this happens when Whitey and Eleanor were having family over, who were so bizarre, they made them look like the sane ones. He was thinking of it having a vibe like National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. At this point, though, it's probably never going to happen. Roughly 6 months after the release of 8 Crazy Nights, Jackie and Adam got married. They had 2 kids and are still together today. Kearsley continued on in animation, working on shows like Slacker Cats, Take Two with Phineas and Ferb, and The Looney Tunes Show. He also has a YouTube channel and is very active on Twitter. Speaking of, in 2022, something odd happened. Someone on Twitter who follows the director took the poster for 8 Crazy Nights and removed the text. People took this template and used it to make their own memes. The director laughed and told everyone to go nuts with it. He said it was a nice way to celebrate the upcoming 20th anniversary, and shared some alternate art because he was the one who drew this version of the poster. Every holiday season, 8 Crazy Nights gets a bump on the IMDb with people looking it up. And now with social media, he gets pictures from fans letting him know they're watching it year after year, how it became a holiday tradition. He says it means a lot to the people who poured their hearts and souls into the production. Thousands of hours of animation work was put into this from people all over the world. It may not seem like it, but it's a special movie to a lot of people. Kearsley said the film was a sore spot for a little while, but he's come to love it and is proud of the work that was done. He also said he does understand some of the complaints. He didn't have final say on many of the things. Some of the issues audiences have, he agrees with. This was his first feature film, and considering everything it went through, it was no small feat that it ended up actually being completed. It was one last big hurrah for many 2D animation studios. 8 Crazy Nights is a crude, occasionally dark holiday film. It's essentially an Adam Sandler film that just so happens to be animated. Speaking of, the animation in this is beautiful. The animation's so fluid, the first time I saw it, I thought the whole thing was rotoscoped. There really is something special about these, and when they're done right, they stand high above CG. Unfortunately, the industry continues to move away from traditional 2D animation, and in its wake, what we're left with just doesn't have the same magic. 8 Crazy Nights is an amazing feat of persistence and determination. There were numerous times where this could have been scrapped, so seeing it all come together is impressive to say the least. Kearsley and his team made something special, and they deserve way more praise than they'll ever receive. It shows that the people working on this believed in it. They were a huge team of some of the best talent in the industry that came together to make one of the most unusual holiday films of all time. 8 Crazy Nights is possibly the first, last, and only heartwarming animated Hanukkah musical where the lead humps his car and a hairy elderly man nearly dies in an overflowing porta potty.
See something?
Just some deer doing a pyramid.
Okay, well, let's keep looking.